Sitting in my nephew's house a few days ago, I spotted a DVD on his shelf that I'd never noticed before. It was one of those cheesy old horror movies from the 1960s or 70s and had probably been sitting there for years gathering dust, just like all the other movie titles he had lined up on there. Yet on that day, just seeing the title scrawled along the spine in lurid red lettering fashioned to look as if it was dripping, made a flash of cold electricity shoot up my spine and grasp like a vice at my chest. The title of the movie was something along the lines of Curse of the Werewolf. The flash of fear that came with seeing it came not from any recollection of the movie itself, but from one of my own closely guarded memories. One that I keep locked away in a shadowy corner of my mind, in a place that I often refuse to visit. For the rest of that day, and indeed for the following 2 nights and days, I could not get that phrase, Curse of the Werewolf, out of my mind. It played over and over, sounding out the syllables and poking at the memory, in the way that the tongue is drawn to probe at a cut inside the mouth despite the pain that comes with every touch. Each time I played out the sounds, I felt a small wave of nausea rise from the pit of my stomach. Fear that had mixed on its way to the surface with the latent seething anger. Every time I considered those words, I was forced again to remember and to ask myself whether the phrase Curse of the Werewolf should not have come with a question mark. You see, ever since Lon Chaney Jr. had yak hair glued to his face and ran around the screen growling as a werewolf, Hollywood, and Western literature in general, has accepted the idea that being a werewolf, changing into a hybrid creature, hungry for flesh when the moon grows fat, is some kind of terrible affliction that befalls the victims of werewolf attacks. It is a curse, and the werewolf himself is almost as much victim as his prey. With his sad, mournful eyes and pained expressions, Chaney Jr. cemented in our minds forever the idea of an innocent man touched by evil and forced through no fault of his own to become a savage beast. What this version of the narrative forgets to mention, of course, is that sometimes it isn't a curse. Sometimes it's a power that twisted men actively seek out for themselves. Hollywood forgets to mention that in the old stories, in the traditional narratives of werewolves and fiends, the creature was born not out of some hideous curse, but because he chose it. Like the villain of a fairy tale, does not weep over his actions, but instead smiles a toothy grin at the thought of eating grandma, all whilst the taste of human flesh still lingers upon his lips. It's the victims who feel the curse. Victims like Maul and victims like me. For 20 years, I was a police officer, and 3 of them, I was a police officer in Morton. Whilst I saw a lot of things over the course of my career, I can honestly say that in those 3 years, I saw more strange and unusual things than in the previous 2 decades combined. More strange stories than an entire bookshelf full of anecdotes could collect. Yet it was the one with the wolf that ended my career and convinced me to quit the force and that wretched town the very same day. Being fringed as it is by farmland, Morton is a strange little town. In the center, you get the same kinds of crime you'd expect in the nearby city, though on a much smaller scale. On the nearby Marston estate, it was the same. As people overspill from the city to the council estate, so too the crime overspills with them. What was weird about Morton was that alongside this more commonplace crime, you would also get called now and again to more rural or farm-related crimes, which seemed to sit alongside the normal crime in a very odd mix. One night you'd be called to investigate a break-in or bike theft, whilst the next you would be charging someone for stealing fertilizer or damaging a border fence. A common incident I was often called to deal with was the killing of livestock by domestic dogs. At least once a month, I would receive a call from one farmer or another telling me about how his sheep or chicken had been murdered by a stray dog from the local town, or that bloody Alsatian from the Marston estate. Invariably, I would be called out in the frigid gray of an early morning to observe the still steaming body of some sheep or lamb that had been killed by a dog. I would regularly be forced to stand over the blood-stained carcass, lying on the frost-covered ground like a prop from some gothic horror film, as the farmer presented it to me like evidence in a high court murder trial, as if this was the first sheep ever killed by a dog. Strange as it sounds, I actually became quite used to these early morning call-outs about which little or nothing could ever be done. So when I received a call from Eddie Tanner that May morning, I assumed it was just more of the same, though of course it wasn't. When I first saw Eddie's sheep, 4 of them, lying in a scattered mess across his field, I assumed it had been some kind of farming accident. That some local idiot had tried to steal a combine harvester or a tractor with a grass cutter attached and had inadvertently mowed down the sheep, ripping them into a ragged crimson mess I was now looking at. Eddie assured me that I wasn't. Unlike many of the other farmers who would report the incidents in a dramatic flurry of excitement, Eddie was almost silent. He stared glassy-eyed and stunned at the shredded remains of his sheep and for a long time did not speak at all. Then in a hoarse voice that sounded almost as ragged and tattered as the remains before me, he said quietly, "It weren't a dog that did this. It were a werewolf. A bloody great wolf standing up on its back legs and running like a man does around the fields. It were taller than me. Bloody hell, I've never seen anything so horrible in my life." He stopped for a moment and clearly sensed my incredulity, continued softly, shaking his head, seeming in disbelief at his own words even as they spilled from his mouth. "I got the bastard who did it, you know. I got him locked in the barn. I found him here, stark naked and lying between them, all covered in blood. He must have changed back, you see." 5 minutes later, I was standing in Eddie's barn, looming over a young man, curled in a ball, naked as the day he was born and caked all over in a gruesome soup of bloody innards that stained his skin to a red-brown rust. At first, I wondered if I was going to have to charge Eddie with kidnapping, but was assured that the man had been carried by him and 2 other farmhands into the barn to stop him from freezing out there. I covered the man in blankets and a foil heat preserver from my car, sat him up and gave him hot tea. After a while, he seemed to come to his senses, and in the absence of any visible injury or illness, I decided it best to take him to the station rather than the hospital. It was around 8 hours later that the young man, bathed, rested, and kitted out in some random clothes we had knocking about the station, found himself sitting opposite me in the small station interview room. I decided early on not to interview him straight away, but to let him sleep off whatever cocktail of drink and drugs had led him to do what he did. When I walked in, I found that he was no longer wearing that stunned expression I had seen on him when we'd found him, but instead a wide and cruel-looking grin. Over the course of the next 3 hours, the young man who would only give his name as the Big Bad Wolf confessed not only to killing Eddie's sheep, but to 4 unsolved mysteries. Cases in which 3 children and 1 teenager had disappeared without a trace. The young man named them, gave details of exactly where they had disappeared and seemingly details of how they met their end. One was a victim in Morton, 1 in the city and 2 in small villages down south. Never once during these frank confessions did he show the slightest remorse. Instead, he described in revolting details the circumstances of his crimes and how we would never find the bodies because, according to him, he had already eaten them. According to him, such a feat would not be possible in his human form, and so each month, with the help of a wolf skin, baby fat stolen from a local mortuary that he rubbed all over himself, and spells he had learned long ago, he had purposely and deliberately transformed himself into a wolf with the express purpose of hunting and consuming children. "I," he said with a stomach-churning relish, "have chosen to become a monster. Worked and slaved for hours and days to transform myself to become a beast. I am the Big Bad Wolf. Come to eat your children." Needless to say, it didn't take me long to decide that this guy needed to be kept in custody and transferred the next morning to the city. I filed charges against him and booked him into the cells for the night in order to give myself time to check out the names he gave us in his statement. I remember vividly locking him away for the night, watching as he glared at me with the same fixed grin and thinking to myself that even if this guy hadn't done what he had claimed and was simply a nutjob, we had done well by keeping him locked up. Though, of course, my celebration was premature. At this point, I have to say I didn't believe in werewolves. What I saw before me was not some Hollywood monster, but a man with serious mental health issues and quite possibly a delusional but nevertheless despicable murderer. Admittedly, I did think a lot about what Eddie had told me, of how a black shape far taller than a man, with the head the size of a lion's, had run at great speed across his fields and torn his livestock to pieces. I thought also of the animals I'd seen, of the terrible injuries that they had endured and of how specific portions of their bodies were still missing. But still, my suspicion was of a crazy man and nothing more. It was only the following morning that I began to change my mind. Walking into the station, I was at first surprised by the silence. Usually Maul, the night officer, would meet me at the desk, and even if he didn't, I would hear him clattering around somewhere in the offices behind. When I was met with silence instead, I began to become suspicious. When I saw the blood, I began to panic. Turning the corner, seeing the cell door wide open and looking down at Maul's torn and crumpled body, broken and slumped like a dish rag on the floor, I felt like being sick. Over and over, I told myself that it didn't make sense. Again and again, I asked myself how. How could that young man have escaped? How could have broken the lock on the cell door, bust the door, and gotten into the corridor? How could this scrawny, unkempt young man overpower and maim someone like Maul, a fully grown man armed with a baton and taser? I asked myself, how was it possible that a young man, no bigger than most teenagers, could have torn the flesh clean from my close friend's throat? Over and over, I asked myself how. It was only when I saw the trail, the line of bloody paw prints that led to the back door, that I realized at once that he couldn't. The bodies of the 4 victims mentioned by that young man have never been found, and neither, I'm sorry to say, has he. These are the 2 facts that I carry with me every single day. Almost, you could say, like a curse.